This is Anders Fremstad again, and today we're going to present our definition of capitalism in the second lecture of Econ 202. So we finished our first class by asking what explains history's hockey sticks in labor productivity and income. And the answer I wanted you to consider is, can capitalism explain this? Is the advent of capitalism what led to the first sustained period of economic growth in human history? The productive power of capitalism has been noted by many. Some wrote that the bourgeoisie has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals, the bourgeoisie being the capitalist class. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? This was actually written by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, so even some of the most important critics of capitalism have understood that capitalism is, if nothing else, very productive. Right? Today we want to step back and define capitalism, which is, of course, an economic system. Right? This picture on the right is propaganda from the industrial workers of the world, suggesting that capitalism is sort of an unjust economic system in which workers hold up and provide for the well-being of all forms of elites. But capitalism is better characterized as a combination of institutions. It's built around private property, markets, and firms. Right? But even capitalist economies rely on non-capitalist institutions. For example, most of you grew up in families, right, where you do not buy and sell things within families. My kids don't pay me to make them breakfast, and I rarely pay them to mow the lawn. Right? We are just we cooperate in a way that we do not cooperate with people outside of our family. Government is also sort of a non-capitalist institution. If you go to the public library, you don't have to pay anything. Walking down the streets that the government provides, they don't charge you for the most part, and so on. So there are non-capitalist elements and institutions in capitalist economies, but what makes the United States capitalist, right, is its reliance on private property, markets, and firms in shaping its economy. Right. Now, what's important to recognize is that capitalism hasn't been around all that long, but private property, for example, has. So in a capitalist system, most production takes place within firms. Actually, most people go to work for some sort of private firm, right, owned by capitalists or a bunch of people. Right? Corporations are owned by millions of people. Right? I have a very small stake in companies like Amazon and Google. In my retirement account, my 401k. Right? But there are a bunch of economies that rely on private property. Right? Even markets have been around for a long time, where people produce their own things but then trade with one another. Right? You can imagine a market economy with family-based production, where you're working within your family, but you're selling things to other families. Right? In a capitalist economy, you also have firms. Most people are working in those firms. So production takes place in firms, and the inputs and outputs of those firms are private property. In capitalism, economic power is on the one hand concentrated in the hands of owners and managers of these firms. It's also limited by competition with other firms. Right? So if you're producing, managing, or owning, if you own a firm that has other firms that compete with it, right, then of course you're constrained in what wages you can pay workers. If you want to hire someone, you need to pay about what the competing firms are paying. And in terms of the price that you can charge customers, you need to charge close to the price that other firms are paying as well. There are other economic systems. Right? Slavery in ancient times was an economic system. Feudalism, bit different from slavery. Right? You don't buy and sell serfs, but serfs had responsibilities to farm certain land, to provide the lords with the surplus. You can family-based production is sort of, you can imagine my grandmother just a century ago, her family was essentially engaged in family-based production. They did sell some goods at market, so there was some little market-based, but none of them worked for firms. They worked for themselves. Socialism. This is a picture of state socialism in the Soviet Union. Right? It's also a different economic system. People went and had jobs for firms, but the firms weren't privately owned. The firms were all run by the government. Right? Distinguishing between these different types of economic systems, of course, is difficult. There is overlap. Slavery, for example, which you can think of as an ancient sort of economic system in the United States, right? We have a history of slavery that's very much capitalist in many ways. Matthew Desmond has an article in the 1619 Project suggesting that some of the brutality of American capitalism you can trace back to slavery, which in the United States was a sort of capitalist institution. So at least those plantations were being run similarly to capitalist firms, the difference being that they bought and sold slaves rather than hiring wage labor. It's important to recognize that capitalism is not the same thing as democracy. So a democracy is a political system defined by individual rights, including freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. It's also, there are fair elections in which, according to the book, virtually all adults are eligible to vote, in which the loser leaves office. Right? So for a democracy, those things need to be present. But capitalism is very much distinct from democracy. Right? Capitalism coexists with many political systems. There are dictatorships, right, that will still rely on a capitalist economic organization, and there are democracies. Capitalism emerged in Britain and other countries before democracy. Right? Capitalism emerged in Britain when there was still a pretty strong monarchy. And capitalism exists today in China, for example, which may not fit the definition of democracy. Of course, political systems are also difficult to classify clearly. So how is it that capitalism improved living standards? Well, the key argument attributed to Adam Smith, the first of the great economists highlighted in this book, one of the key arguments is specialization, that the growth of firms and the expansion of markets allowed for an unprecedented division of labor, where people got to do exactly that part of production that they were best at. Capitalism also led to improvements of technological progress, because firms competing with one another had strong incentives to adopt and develop new and more productive technologies, right? If you adopt a more productive technology that lets you sell your output at a lower price than competitors, you can expand production massively, hire up more workers, and take over this sort of market. So these arguments are usually attributed to Adam Smith. Adam Smith was born in 1723 and passed away in 1790. He was a student of philosophy, and he's considered by many to be the father of economics. His groundbreaking works are The Theory of Moral Sentiments and An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, often called simply Wealth of Nations. Smith is famous for popularizing the radical view that individual self-interest can serve the public good. I think it's important to recognize what a radical idea this was in 1776 when Smith sort of popularized it. Right? In 1776, most people in Britain, Scotland, and the West in general, right, thought that the reason society worked is not because people were just serving their self-interest, but because they were sort of doing the things, they're fulfilling their responsibilities, and that responsibility was an important component of social cohesion. Right? Smith made an argument that actually, if you just let people do what's best for them as individuals, that can serve the public good. He's often associated with the idea that free markets generate prosperity, but he's also argued that governments need to provide for national defense, for justice, for education, infrastructure, and so on. Smith is perhaps most famous for discussing the invisible hand and how the invisible hand of profit maximization, utility maximization, can lead to a nice outcome for all of society. That said, Adam Smith has a nuanced view of self-interest. In The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, he wrote, "How selfish soever man may be supposed," and it should be man or woman, right? "There are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." So here Smith is recognizing the fact, right, that people often care about one another for no reason, it seems, except that they care about the happiness of other people. Right? That's why you might hold the door open for the person behind you, or help someone on the side of the road with a flat tire. Not because it helps you out in any material way, but because it brings you joy to help out someone else, to improve their own happiness. In 1776, though, he noted the converse as well. He wrote in A Wealth of Nations that man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren. Right? We always need help of one another, and it is in vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. He writes, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages." Right? Smith's point here, right, is that when he goes out to eat, right, it's not that the butcher, the brewer, and the baker care for him and provide him with his dinner. It's that he buys these things from the butcher, the brewer, and the baker. Right? They're just interested in making a good living at presumably the task that they're well suited to perform, right? Bake or cut up meat or brew beer, right? But they're driven by their self-interest. And Smith's making this argument that self-interest can be used for the public good, right? It can be it's the main way, actually, in which we get help from other people, is by exchanging with them. Ironically, you might want to know who cooked Adam Smith's dinner. For the most part, Adam Smith lived with his mother. And this sort of caring labor, parents looking after children, is often ignored by economists. Malcolm Harris writes, "Much of women's domestic and reproductive labor quite literally does not factor within economic models. The old joke is that GDP, gross domestic product, declines when an economist marries his housekeeper, which is not so much a joke as a good explanation of gross domestic product and what it does not account for." Right? This gets back to some of the issues we noted, some of the problems with using GDP as a measure of economic well-being that we addressed earlier this week. Right? If the economist hires the housekeeper and then pays for housekeeping services and so on, that will be a good that comes into GDP, and the income of the economist will be the same, right? But then the housekeeper will have income as well that comes from that economist, right? As soon as the economist marries his housekeeper or her housekeeper, right? What happens? Well, you no longer pay your spouse usually to do things for you. There's no longer a market transaction, so even the house is cleaned exactly the same way, it wouldn't contribute to gross domestic product. And the point here is there are lots of things, of course, that we do that are productive in life that don't contribute to GDP and don't produce any income. Caring for children and the elderly are some of the large components of this. And of course, that caring work for the most part is not done because people get some sort of benefit for doing it. It's done because they care about one another, right? So economics often overlooks that, but of course that's all economics as well. If you're interested in these sorts of topics, I would urge you to check out Econ 211, Gender in the Economy. So what are these gains from specialization? Well, people are more productive when they focus on a limited range of activities due to differences in ability, right, where you just do what you are good at, born good at. Learning by doing, where you start to do something, get better at doing it by practicing, and then keep doing it because you're now one of the more productive people at it. And economies of scale. Right? People only specialize, of course, start doing one specific task if they can acquire all the other goods they need from other people who have specialized. Specialization of the division of labor raises the question, of course, about how the goods are going to be distributed. Economic equity gets to be an important topic. If you missed reading The Oxcart Man as a child, you should read it. And it's a story about a very self-sufficient family, but that does sell some surplus potatoes, apples, and cloth at market to acquire a knife, needle, and peppermint candy, which they cannot produce themselves. Adam Smith pointed to specialization within a pin factory. Right? He said, looking at a pin factory that he toured, a workman not educated in this business could scarce perhaps make one pin a day. He's saying if you had to make a pin today, you'd make about one. But he says he went to a factory in which everyone had a very specific task, where 10 men could make among them upwards of 48,000 pins in a day. Right? His point is that the specialization, this division of labor, didn't make people a little bit better at producing pins. It made them 1,000 times better at producing pins, right? And that's sort of the source of the economic growth, the increase in living standards that we've seen over the last couple centuries. I want to walk you through an example in the textbook, right, where Greta and Carlos, right, have different comparative advantages, and they're going to benefit from trading with one another. Right? Imagine that both Greta and Carlos can grow apples or wheat. Right? So if Greta just grows apples 100% of the time, she'll grow 1,250 apples, or she could grow 50 tons of wheat, or any linear combination of these two. Carlos, on the other hand, can grow just 1,000 apples if he just grows apples, or 20 tons of wheat if he just grows wheat, or again, a linear combination of those two. So Greta has an absolute advantage in producing both goods, right? She could produce more apples than Carlos could produce if she just produced apples. She can produce a lot more wheat than Carlos if she just produces wheat. But Greta has a comparative advantage in producing wheat. And the way you see that is how much does it cost Greta to produce 1 ton of wheat? Well, 1 ton of wheat costs Greta 1,250 apples divided by 50. It costs her 25 apples, right? To produce 1 extra ton of wheat would cost her 25 apples. She would have to give up 25 apples because you'd have to put aside some land, more land to grow wheat. Meanwhile, 1 ton of wheat costs Carlos 1,000 divided by 20. It costs Carlos 50 apples, right? So Carlos has a comparative advantage in producing apples, right? 1 apple costs Carlos 20 by 1,000, 0.02 tons or 20 kilograms of wheat, if these are metric tons. Meanwhile, 1 apple costs Greta 40 kilograms of wheat. So Greta has a comparative advantage in producing wheat, and Carlos has a comparative advantage in producing apples. The reason for that, right, is Greta is she's 2.5 times as productive at producing wheat as Carlos, but just 25% more productive at producing apples. So her comparative advantage will be in wheat, Carlos's then will be in apples. And the important thing to recognize here is even though Greta has an absolute advantage in both goods, Carlos still is going to have a comparative advantage in producing one of them. Right? What does that mean? Well, imagine that Carlos and Greta start out being self-sufficient, and Greta decides to produce 500 apples and 30 tons of wheat. Right? So half her land is in apples, half is in wheat. And Carlos decides to produce 300 apples and 14 tons of wheat. Well, then together they will have produced 800 apples, 500 plus 300, and 44 tons of wheat, 30 plus 14. Imagine instead that they completely specialize in their comparative advantage. In that case, Greta would only produce wheat. She produced 0 apples but 50 tons of wheat. And Carlos would produce 1,000 apples and 0 tons of wheat. They both completely specialized. Right? What we see here is now they produce more apples and more wheat than they previously produced when they were self-sufficient. Right? Because that's possible, right, that means they can trade. Specifically, Greta, right, has 50 tons of wheat. She can give 15 of those to Carlos in exchange for 600 apples. Right? If they do that, Greta will end up with 600 apples and 35 tons of wheat. Carlos will have 400 apples and 15 tons of wheat. Right? And in total, of course, they have both more apples and more wheat, just like they did before, but the important thing to recognize is by trading, they could both be better off than they were when they were self-sufficient. Right? Greta has an extra 100 apples, an extra 5 tons of wheat. Carlos has an extra 100 apples and an extra 1 ton of wheat. And of course, who gets those gains from trade, right? Where that surplus goes sort of depends on what price they agreed to exchange apples for wheat for. Here, remember, they exchanged 15 tons of wheat for 600 apples. Now, did capitalism really cause history's hockey sticks? Well, we've seen a bunch of these now, right? In income per capita, in lighting, in transportation speed, in world population, in carbon emissions, even in mortality. There's been a pretty strong reduction in deaths from conflicts over the last few decades, right? Did capitalism cause history's hockey sticks? I want you to take a moment and pause the video and think about whether or not you're convinced capitalism can explain it. In science, when we want to think about whether or not X causes Y, we do it in two ways. Usually it's by understanding the relationship between cause and effect and performing experiments to gather evidence excuse me, by measuring X and Y. But proving causation is very difficult in economics because the economy is very complex, right? It's hard to understand all the relationships between 7-8 billion people in the same way that you can understand the chemistry relationships between different molecules in these beakers. It's also hard because we generally can't or shouldn't perform large-scale experiments on entire populations. We can't just pour a little bit of capitalism in a society and see what happens. Right? Also, capitalism emerged in Europe about the same time as the Enlightenment and the expansion of free speech and democracy. Right? So how do we know if capitalism caused this uptick in say, incomes over time, or if it was free speech or democracy or some other factor? It gets challenging to do. One place to look is Germany's natural experiment with capitalism. After World War II, Germany was split divided between West Germany, right, which was sort of temporarily run by the US, France, and Britain, and East Germany, which was occupied by the Soviet Union. And then those countries ended up experimenting with capitalism, right, where we had a capitalist economic system in West Germany and a state socialist system in East Germany. In 1950, right, here we have GDP per capita on a ratio scale. In 1950, so soon after World War II, West Germany was wealthier than East Germany, or they had a higher GDP per capita. Right? So let's imagine that the experiment starts at 1950, right? The first 5 years after World War II, it was mostly just picking up the rubble. What happens then over the next 40 years? Well, you can see the blue curve and the East German curve, right? They get further apart as you move down, right? And since this is on a ratio scale, really the gap between those two lines you can use to think about the actual relative difference in income per capita, suggesting, right, over those 40 years, West Germany grew at a faster rate than East Germany. Capitalism seemed to work better than state socialism. I note there's not a huge difference here, right? There was growth under the Soviet system as well, or the East German system, but it does look like it grew a bit slower. For example, you can see that East Germany grew at a much slower rate than Spain and especially Japan over these years. Another place you might look is Vietnam, a place that I've visited and taught in. Right? In 1887, the French consolidated their control over Vietnam, so that's right about here. Of course, from 1945 to 1975, the Vietnamese fought for independence from the French and then from the United States. But in 1975, right about here, right, Saigon was captured by the communist North Vietnam. And in 2010, the ruling Communist Party approved a 10-year plan with a greater role for capitalist development. What you see, though, so this is again on a ratio scale, what you see is it looks like sometime around 1980 or so, economic growth in Vietnam took off, and they've, on that part of the hockey stick. Right there, it's not as clear. I mean, is that capitalism? I mean, after about 2000, it's increasingly capitalist, but it looks like also under their state socialist system beforehand, they started growing at a much faster rate, right? It could have as much to do with independence from imperial powers than anything else. So the evidence is mixed. Some pictures of Vietnam today. Here are my kids enjoying bubble tea in Hanoi, and here's some traffic in Ho Chi Minh City. You also see that growth is very different in different countries. So for example, over the last 100 years, right, South Korea has had tremendous growth, at least since 1950, right, in a capitalist economy. Botswana, right, here in the pink, also significantly outperformed Nigeria over this period. The Soviet Union, though, grew faster than Argentina from 1928 to 1990. Right? So if you, right, Argentina was actually pretty well off in 1928. The Soviet Union much poorer, but by 1990 they were about the same. The forms of capitalism that replaced central planning or state socialism in the Soviet Union led to huge reductions in living standards, right? And now we see increase in income since about 2000, although even today, right, in Russia and the former Soviet Union, people are not much better off than they were before they abandoned socialism. In general, capitalism fails to raise living standards when private property is not secure, when markets are not competitive, and when firms are owned or managed by people with government connections or privileged birth. Right? If you have a capitalist system that's just essentially a different form of aristocracy, you tend not to see the same kind of economic growth. Where I lived in Guatemala City after I graduated from college in Zona Doce, right, that area, I mean, it's capitalist, but it's benefited very little from capitalism. Right? People still live in pretty poor